Hello, this is Arlo Kilpatrick, the erudite counterfile, and today I wanted to start off a new series on the ethics of zoosexuality. Of course, before I get into my ethical positions, I need to sort of define what these principles I'm basing this on are. And I'm perfectly willing to look at other ethical theories if they are suggested to me, but for now I'm going on Peter Singer's preference utilitarian viewpoint, as espoused in his book Practical Ethics, which is a wonderful introduction to very basic ethical issues, things which can clearly be reasoned about by basically anyone, no matter what ethical theory they subscribe to, assuming, of course, that reason can be used to discuss ethical questions at all, which I think it can. So, before I get into what ethics is, we need to clear up a few points about what ethics is not. First of all, ironically from the standpoint of why I'm doing this video series, ethics is not primarily concerned with sex. Yes, there are ethical issues involved with sex, just like in any other interaction with other people, and other animals even. But there are those who think that ethics is mainly about telling people what they can or can't do in the bedroom. The Westboro Baptist Church is a fine example of that sort of simplified and perverse ethic, and it's frankly untrue. The fact is that there are much graver issues related to morality than just who sleeps with who, and in what position. So, the principles that are going to be developed in this series are going to be used later on to treat the morality of bestiality. But that topic, indeed sex in general, isn't discussed in the book Practical Ethics. So I'm not going to be getting that part of it directly from Singer himself. Secondly, ethics is not good in theory, but not in practice. The fact is that ethics is all about the practical system of reasoning and intuition that we use to make judgments about what actions would be best to perform on behalf of ourselves and those around us. So, if that's what ethics is, then an ethical judgment can't really be good in theory but not in practice, since if it's of no use in practice, it can't really be of any use in theory either, since the whole point of the theory is to guide our practice, to help us make good decisions about our actions. There are those who would claim, in attacking a straw man, that ethics could be boiled down to a simple set of rules which are clearly not fit for every situation. For example, the Ten Commandments, or the Golden Rule, or any other very simple system. But life is too complicated for that, I think. And as such, we can't expect these extremely simple rule systems to have the best results all the time. And to steal an analogy from gambling, it's like in blackjack. Yes, there are very simple strategies to playing blackjack, but those simple strategies tend to lose in the long run. If you want to be really good at the game, you need to do the work and learn A, the more complicated strategies involved, and B, how to use your reasoning on the fly to figure out when your system of rules needs to be changed. There are, of course, more complicated systems of rules that you could use to get around the problem that these simple rule systems simply don't work. This is the position that Kant's moral theory takes. The position is known by their adherents as deontologists. However, there are other ethical systems that rely on an analysis of the consequences of our actions, rather than the applications of rules, simple or otherwise. This is mainly the standpoint that I'm going to make in this series, Because I do think that there are some sorts of objective ethical rules out there, but I think that the best way to get at them is by figuring out the consequences of our actions. Third, ethics is not completely based on religion. Now, this one is controversial to some diehard religious believers because they define good as what God approves of, or what is in God's nature, or some other viewpoint which makes it entirely dependent on God. But there's a problem in philosophy known as the Euthyphro dilemma, which kind of takes the water out of this argument. And basically, it is the question of supposing that there is a God that makes moral pronouncements which are good, we must ask which came first. In other words, did God make those pronouncements because they are good? Or are those pronouncements good simply because they came from this God? The moment you say that these pronouncements are good because they came from this particular source, you lose any capacity to reason about what is and isn't good, since it's entirely dependent on this being's subjective whims. Of course, you don't even have to go that far. You could claim that there is an objective moral standard outside of a god, but that this god is essentially the enforcer of that standard, providing reward for those who do good and punishment for those who do evil. But in my opinion, these self-interested reasons for doing good aren't really doing good at all. From the standpoint of the person making decisions based on this, that's just being smart, getting what's best for you. And that's really not what ethics is all about. Really, ethics is about doing what's best for everybody, not just for you. And we'll get more into that point later. But yeah. Also, to those who would claim that morality was somehow uniquely granted to human beings, there are other animal species which show us the beginnings of moral systems. For example, chimpanzees seem to have a sense of fairness and reciprocity, which is uncannily like ours, so that we can't really say that we have moral judgments and they do not. There's more of a spectrum involved, on which more social and more neurologically complex creatures sit on the higher end of the spectrum and are able to reason more clearly about what is best for their groups. But if we're going to say that we evolved these morals, that's not the same thing as saying that these morals are necessarily correct. To take an example from the sexual realm, lots of people are disgusted by homosexuality just at a visceral level. They just feel sick to their stomachs when they think about it. And this does have something of an evolutionary basis, because that sort of activity doesn't propagate the species all that well. But now that the species is propagating just fine, and we have more medical advances and different circumstances which make it far less harmful to be homosexual than it was in the past, because we have this stuff, it's difficult to say that homosexuality is immoral, even though lots of people feel that way, because circumstances have changed, and our moral intuitions need not always be correct. Now, some might argue, well, these intuitions are natural, And things which are natural, whether they came from a god or whether they came from evolution or whatever, because they're natural, they have to be good for us somehow. Somebody must have known what they were doing. But what is natural is kind of irrelevant to the question of what is moral, since, as John Stuart Mill pointed out in his essay on nature, depending on the word natural is defined, it might apply to everything in the universe, and therefore it would be useless as a way to distinguish between what is moral and what isn't. Or it applies only to the world as it would be without human intervention, in which case every action that human beings take is to some degree unnatural. And once again, because all of these actions are in the same category, we can't really distinguish between what is moral or not simply by what is natural. So we are free to question our moral intuitions, whether they come from a god or from nature or from tree spirits if you believe in that, or whatever. The point is, we have a reasonable basis by which to ask where these morals come from and what might be good about them, what might be better, depending on what we do. So, in the next video, I'll go into moral relativism and why I believe that moral relativism doesn't adequately encompass the opinions we tend to have about morality.